Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today at Thomas Balch Library. My name is Nora Schneider. I am the Library Genealogy Associate here. Thank you so much for joining us for Identification and Care of Photographs with our Curator of Manuscripts and Archives, Laura Christiansen. I am going to hand things right over to Laura so we can get started with this very interesting topic today. She has a lot of great photographs and history to tell you, so I do not want to waste any time, and I'm going to hand things right on over to Laura. If you do have any questions throughout the class, we will be getting to those throughout the class, so please don't hold on to them to the end. Put them in the Q&A box. Make sure that you are sending them to either host or Leesburg events so that I can see them, and we will get those answered. If you have any technology issues, please email those to balchlib@leesburgva.gov. I put that email address in the chat box, and we will be glad to help you. So Laura, take it away.
Thanks, Nora. Hopefully you can hear me. Welcome. Thank you all for joining us today for identification and care of photographs. I'm really excited to teach this class again. It is one of my favorite things to talk about here at the library because photographs provide such an excellent window into the past, what people wore, what they saw, how they expressed themselves, and they are such treasured objects in our home collections. Just a couple of notes before we get started. I'm going to cover a lot of stuff. When Nora was very apt in her statement, I always pull too many examples because I just want to show things. The goal of this class is to talk about the history of the medium, so the history of photography as it evolved and how that can affect preservation. So the front part of the class is going to be a quick run through some different media that we have and that you may find in your personal collections, and then we'll talk generally about preservation, although you will find tips about preservation throughout. I welcome questions, so if you have questions during the program that you would like to ask, please feel free to go ahead and put them in, and Nora will relay them to me. So normally when we're teaching this in person, you're able to do that in the classroom while you look at the objects, and I certainly will try to replicate that there. So I'm gonna go ahead and do the first step for working with photographs, and I'm going to put on some gloves. So these are white cotton gloves. You can also use some gloves that are the nitrile gloves. You don't want to use them powdered free. The reason we're putting on gloves for photographs, if you took, for instance, my colleague Gabrielle Sanchez's wonderful home preservation for archives class, home archives preservation class last month, you'll realize she told you do not wear gloves. For photographs, most of the media that we're going to look at today, you do want to wear gloves because the oils on your hands can actually damage the photographic surface. There are some that you do not want to wear gloves with, such as glass plate negatives, but in general, gloves are great. So I got my gloves on, and we're going to switch over to a PowerPoint presentation and get started. So, what is really great here is in talking about the identification and care of photographs is how these items all affect us. We all have photographs in our lives. There is no way around it. It is a media that is ubiquitous in our homes and in our lives. I probably have about 5,000 photographs in my pocket right now on my cell phone. Which may be a problem. But it's such a wonderful way to capture events in our lives, to learn more about how things around us have changed over time, to see the growth of our children, to share the memories of loved ones. Today, as I mentioned, we're going to cover the history of photography and the development of photographic media, a little bit of how to identify different types of media, preservation issues of photographs, some best practices for handling and storage, tools, and then of course time for questions. What we cannot cover, because this is a huge topic that really deserves multiple classes, we cannot cover audio-visual recordings, including film, motion picture film, Super 8, unfortunately we just can't do it. Digital media, we will touch a little tiny bit on it because there's no way around it. And disaster recovery. So because these media are so complex, talking about how to recover from a flood or a fire and things like that is really beyond our scope today. And we also cannot talk about complex conservation, although I will refer to things that conservators can help you with and when to go and reach out to them. So let's take a look really quickly at a cross-section of photographs. On the screen, you should be seeing a daguerreotype here in the bottom left-hand corner, a carte de visite, a nice snapshot of a baseball team that's modern, and some other images of photographs. It may seem, looking at these, that these are all very different. The daguerreotype, which we'll take a look at a few more in a couple seconds, is a lumpy object. It's an artifact. It comes in a case. It's very impressive and gilt. Meanwhile, maybe the snapshot is less impressive. It looks sort of quick and dirty and in the moment. I will tell you that across all of the photographic media we're going to look at today, there are several things in common, and that is how they are built. So all photographs have a image layer, a base that's on, usually some sort of paper, metal, or other material, and then a backing, something to make it more stable. In the image layer, you have chemicals that have been applied to create this image using light, and those chemicals continue to age over time. What we need to do to be preservation minded is to be aware of how each of the media are built, like what are these layers made of, and what the preservation challenges that face them are. So diving into our little time travel trip today, we're going to go from the very beginning of photography to more recent times. And I'm going to go pretty fast. Please know I will share my slides with you after the class. I am always available to answer questions. And also I'll give you some resources, links to resources where you can learn more. So you may be familiar with the word daguerreotype, but you may not have met wonderful Louis Daguerre, who we have here in the upper left-hand corner. Louis Daguerre is known as the father of photography, right or wrong. He in 1837 began inventing or tooling around with silver salts. So he discovered quite by accident, and building on the discoveries of several other gentlemen in the 1820s, that silver salts were reactive to light. So if you left a jar of silver salts next to the window, the side that was closest to the window got very dark. Somewhat by accident, he exposed a plate to silver salts at one point and realized that he caught an image on the plate. So working around with these and pairing with a gentleman named Niep, Louis Daguerre actually developed the wonderful daguerreotype. So in 1839, after his partner Niep had died, Daguerre introduced this new technology to the world by presenting a paper at the Royal Academy of Science in France. And he very modestly declared that his new media was the daguerreotype, kind of leaving out his partner. This was a revolution. So let's take a look really quickly here at some daguerreotypes so we can see how exciting this innovation was. And I'm going to click back and forth here to do some movie magic. So hopefully you are now seeing 3 cased objects on the screen. Let's see. Yes, looks good. So these are daguerreotypes. These are from the Thomas Balch Library's collection. And you can see very quickly what these items look like. So these are cased photographs, meaning they came encased in these little neat boxes. And there is a little bit of delay on the document camera, so I'm going to try to hold things very still, but you will see a bit of fuzzing. So cased photographs, if we open this up, we see that it has a beautiful image. Now these are very hard to show, even here on this live camera, because they are reflective. So how do you make a daguerreotype? We'll look at it a little bit more closely in a minute, but you take a sheet of copper usually and coat it in silver. You use silver salts to activate it, so you expose it to iodine gas, which creates a plate that you can capture an image on. So then that is put into a camera, and the light captures the image, and then you have, voila, your daguerreotype once you develop it. So the thing about daguerreotypes is they are one of. They are individual objects, so there is no negative to make multiple copies. I think we're all very familiar, hopefully still, with using negatives in camera film to produce multiple copies of our images, or in our digital world, we can make as many copies as we want of anything, just very simply. But at this time, the daguerreotype only allowed you to create one. So these beautiful objects are very much like artifacts, and you can see by the cases that they were somewhat treasured. Now, they could have just put these in very simple wooden boxes or in something much less elaborate, but generally you will find them with these gilt frames, with the lovely plush padding. Here we have some embossed velvet. They also would be able to make all sorts of other things with daguerreotypes because it is a metal object. You could make jewelry. So you see people with lockets with daguerreotypes, or even later you'll have rings and other small objects where they've produced very small daguerreotypes. So consider, if you will, the world of 1839, where previously, if you wanted to have a portrait taken of you or your loved one, you had to go to a portrait painter who would then either paint a portrait or potentially do a sketch, do a charcoal drawing. You had to rely on another human being to capture a likeness. There was no way to create a likeness without that sort of intervention of someone else's viewpoint and sort of opinions coming through. Now we were able to capture an image of the world that was somewhat accurate. So to say, this is what this person looks like, and it's a revelation. So daguerreotypes have the amazing ability also to be very, very clear. And I'm very sad that unfortunately it's a little bit difficult to show this. I'm going to actually try increasing the light a little bit. Nope, that didn't help. Hopefully you can have an opportunity to see some of these in person, but what you realize when you look at a daguerreotype is the level of detail. So if we were able to zoom in on this without the unfortunate reflections that I'm getting in the glass, we would be able to go down to level of detail of the buttons or on the chair infinitely without losing the quality of the image. So these don't get pixelated, they don't have dots or anything like that in them. They are just excruciatingly clear images usually, assuming somebody didn't move, because the process did take some time, up to 10-20 minutes sometimes to capture an image. So people did have to stay very, very still. So we have the sheet of polished silver covered with a light sensitive chemical and exposed to light. It took a long time to expose, and we also have multiple sizes. So just very quickly, and then we're going to move on. You have small 9th plates. So this would actually be a 9th plate daguerreotype. Which is about 2.5 inches in height. So you can see very tiny. Within this 9th plate, if I can get it very close to the camera, you're going to see a couple things that are of interest. One is that she has rosy cheeks, where someone has gone in and hand tinted her cheeks. So obviously daguerreotypes captured things in what we would today call grayscale, but black and white. So very early on, artists began to go in and add color. You'll find rosy cheeks, you'll find golden buttons, all sorts of additions. The other thing about this plate is you can see that the silver has started to tarnish and corrode. Really, the image itself is in a type of tarnish, because you have the silver salts, the silver interacting with the chemicals in the light to darken. And this is a process that is going to continue working over time. Keeping it within the case, it's somewhat sealed and a little bit protected from the air, light, things like that that might increase that corrosion and that tarnishing. So if at all possible, if you have daguerreotypes, do not remove them from the case. You've noticed already, I think, from my examples, that our cases, in many cases, have fallen apart. So the leather that held this together has cracked and broken. A conservator definitely could repair that case for us. To give you an example of what happens when the case has broken, we do have this wonderful example from the Johnston collection, where we have a father and son, and you can see, unfortunately, the corrosion and losses in the top of the image. You also see that there's some damage to the case. So this may not just be from the general chemical reactions on the photograph or from light or air. This may be actually from chemicals that got on the photograph at the time of production. So how do we know for sure that we have a daguerreotype? Well, the case is a real clue usually, but the best way to know is this reflective nature that we saw in our first example. If we turn this just right, you can see it's basically polished like a mirror. So if you have a daguerreotype that has issues like we're seeing here, I would recommend consulting a conservator to see if anything can be done. They can, in fact, sometimes improve the image quality to remove some of the tarnishing. They can replace this glass, which we have to remember, glass at this time is not like modern glass. Often it has impurities in it. It too ages over time. So sometimes replacing the glass can improve the image quality. Here, this glass has become somewhat fogged, which is making it a little difficult to see the image. And we can also, in some cases, improve abrasions and scratches and fix loose hardware, such as the hinges of this daguerreotype that have come undone. I would not recommend doing anything to a daguerreotype yourself. We want to avoid cleaning them. We want to avoid adding any chemical products. We just want to handle them very carefully. So here at the library, what we do is actually place them into handy little 4-flap enclosures. And I'll actually kind of show you that. Hold on. Excuse me while I juggle. Yeah, 4-flap enclosures. So you just are able to take the daguerreotype, and we've made a package for it that has 1, 2, 3, 4 flaps. This gets tied or closed in some cases with a fastener, and then your daguerreotype is protected from light, air, things like that. Okay, moving on. Just getting back to our brief history of photography. So 1840 daguerreotypes come out. They're extremely popular. It is not the only medium that is being worked on at the time. Contemporary to Daguerre and his partner in England is William Henry Talbot, who is inventing a completely different process for photography called the calotype. So the calotype is actually a negative positive process. So in that case, Talbot soaks paper in salt water, then adds the silver salts to the top. This is able to make almost something like shadow prints, where whatever shadow or light is cast onto the surface, it gets captured on the paper. He's then able to take that paper and press it against another piece of impregnated paper, that makes a positive copy, so a negative to a positive, which we're much more familiar with today. In this way, Talbot is able to make multiple prints. The Calotype, however, is not the beautiful, clear photograph like the daguerreotype. Because of that negative positive process, the images are fuzzy and they're not quite as good. So people were not as keen on them. Also, they're very ephemeral because they're made of paper and chemicals. So Talbot continues to work on his process. He's a really interesting guy. I highly recommend if you like early modern science, looking into William Henry Talbot. He invented a number of other things. He worked with Herschel, the famous astronomer, all sorts of great things. So I just mentioned Herschel. In 1842, he creates the cyanotype process, and we're going to come back to that because we have some cyanotypes to look at. So at the same time, people continue working. So 1840, the daguerreotype is a sensation. People want to improve on this technology. It comes to America and people begin to work on the process. So by 1851, Frederick Scott Archer has invented collodion, which makes the process way quicker. So you're able to, you know, fix an image in less than 30 minutes, which is, wow, so exciting. That is a chemical that is applied to a glass plate, and then you're also, once again, able to make multiple copies. So we also then move on later to dry plates and other things. We'll talk about those in a second. So marching forward here. Here's just a quick look at the Daguerreo process that explains it in much more scientific detail than I did. As I mentioned, we have our copper. It's polished, sensitized in a dark room, exposed to iodine or various other chemical fumes, put into a camera. And at this time, the camera is basically what was called a camera obscura, which had been used for centuries by artists to draw and sketch from life. So the image is captured by a lens and projected onto a piece of paper. So in replacing the paper with our silver-plated copper, it captures the image, which is a latent image. You can't see it until you add the developer, which is heated vapors of mercury, which seems kind of dangerous if you ask me. And then the plate is bathed in hyposulfate of soda, which removes the developer, hopefully, although sometimes you see examples where it didn't quite get removed, and then it is put into this wonderful gold chloride and then mounted behind glass. So that is a very elaborate process. What we're going to see as we move forward in time is this process becomes more complex, but also quicker and easier for people to do. So materials are created so that you don't have to be a specialist. You don't have to be a Daguerrean artist to create photographs. However, this process of preparing the media, sensitizing it or capturing the image, and then developing it carries throughout. So keep that in mind. So from daguerreotypes to the next type of media, which would be ambrotypes. Ambrotypes, like daguerreotypes, are printed they're individual images that are printed onto glass. So you find them after 1855, and what that process involved is the collodion, which I mentioned a minute ago. It is made of the very dangerous sounding gun cotton, so explosives, and ether, another somewhat dangerous material. So you have to think of early photographers as being kind of brave. The glass coated plate is placed on a dark cloth background, and that means that the negative image you have captured with your camera obscura basically becomes a positive. So we'll just take a quick look at an ambrotype so you can see the difference. And again, the glass is not our friend, but I'm going to hold it up to the camera and hopefully you'll be able to see this image. So here we have a photograph that is a of a small child, and I don't know if you can see because again, it's a little bit dark. Her nurse probably, or her caretaker. So there's a woman behind her who is holding. It could actually be a him because, you know, 19th century small boys also wore elaborate dresses. In fact, now that I look at it, I think I've misgendered this poor child. So this lovely child and their caretaker are here. So, and at a first glance, this looks very much like a daguerreotype. We have the case, and unfortunately, in this instance, we only have one half of the case. We're missing the top. We have the gilt frame, the glass on the top to protect the image. But then we see very quickly that this image itself is missing the reflective qualities of the first couple images we looked at, where they were very polished and looked like mirrors. Here we see it is more of a darker image that is not as reflective. Now, one telltale sign of an ambrotype is that if there are holes, or if in any way that the image layer has become damaged, you can see that dark backing. So instead of getting spots of lighter color or tarnish on top, you will see it get like a dark hole will appear. It looks like the image, like there is a layer missing. So one thing that we have to consider with ambrotypes versus daguerreotypes, and why it's important to kind of figure out which we have, oh, there you can see her a little bit better in the background, is that it's glass. So this could easily break if you drop it. So you want to handle it very carefully. With our daguerreotypes, because of the glass cover, the glass layer in the frames anyway, and ambrotypes in our glass plates, we have purchased special boxes that have a layer of padding and have padded sections for each photograph. We then also put them into enclosures, again, to just add that extra layer of protection. So, switching back here. Let's just talk really briefly about the next couple of things. And I want to highlight that everything we're going to talk about, that we've talked about so far, daguerreotypes and ambrotypes, and then the next three media, tintypes, carte de visites, and cabinet cards, all required that you go to a studio unless you wanted to specialize very heavily in photography and invest in a lot of equipment. Daguerrean studios, photographer studios in the 19th century, which this is going to take us through to the very, very early 20th century, all of these studios were built and designed so that the photographer could control the light in the room. And they became experts at having skylights that face just the right direction to capture just the right strength of sunlight, to manipulating that light to create really wonderful images. So ambrotypes come along in 1854 and they're kind of done by 1865, so they don't last that long. But the next thing that we find out in the world are tintypes, and tintypes definitely last a very long time. So if you've encountered a tintype, you may have not been quite clear on what you were looking at. They can appear kind of to be almost as sharp as daguerreotypes. Let's take a look. Oh, and I've got to take them out of the sleeves because they are reflective. Well, hopefully you can kind of see them. Well, I won't make you sit here while I try to remove these from sleeves with gloves, which is super fun. Okay, so looking at a tintype, what have we got? Tintypes are photographs that were faster, cheaper, and you could make multiples. What they were able to do using glass plate negatives, they were able to print the photograph onto a very thin layer of tin. And I think this is a really great example here. I'm going to actually turn on the light. So you can see the backing of this wonderful portrait has the exposed 10 layer. So this is just metal. 10 was ubiquitous. It was a lot cheaper than definitely a copper-plated silver, a silver-plated copper plate. And it was much more portable because you could make multiple copies, so you could share them out, you could clip them into different sizes and shapes, instead of having the elaborate cases. You could just create an elaborate paper frame. So here we have a lovely image. One problem with Tintypes as time progresses, however, is that they do continue to develop. So the image gets darker, and also the 10 gets darker as it ages, making it sometimes a little bit hard to see the image. The other problem with Tintypes is that you do not have the glass layer like you did with Daguerreotypes and Ambrotypes to protect the photograph. So you end up with an image that's kind of hard for television to see on our document camera here. I'm trying to get it just right. There we go. You get an image that darkens over time and that is very prone to being scratched or otherwise damaged. So here is where knowing the media really helps us out. You can see the issues that both of these Tintypes have encountered. We have areas where the photographic emulsion has begun to crack and flake. I don't know if you can see here the sort of ripples in this image, which is where the emulsion is starting to come off the photograph. When we're talking about emulsion, that is the chemical layer. In some cases, you'll notice that this Tintype is really kind of shiny. They've put on top another chemical layer to protect that image, which is great because it can help prevent things like we see here. This Tintype was heavily scratched, unfortunately. So we have a big scratch there, and each scratch is going to help that photographic layer lift off. So we also can see this photograph was probably folded or framed at some point because we have these definite ridges. And because of the fold, the rust has started. So the major issue you encounter with Tintypes is abrasions, flaking, rust, and cracking, all of which sort of derive from the tin media. Now, you may have Tintypes that have been put into cases to sort of look like Daguerreotypes. They are much more affordable, but you could still fancy them up. Or you may have Tintypes that are in paper frames like this, which look like sort of the next media we're going to talk about, which is carte visites. This is the size of a carte visite, but it's definitely tin. How do you know? How do you know if you have a Tintype and if you need to worry about the metal? So this is in a paper frame. We might not know that there's metal underneath. All you need is a handy magnet, and you'll find that the magnet will stick to the Tintype. So a really quick way to know. It also works with case photos where you could put the magnet onto the front of the glass. If it's a Tintype, it's going to be attracted to the tin inside. So here we don't, because this is an Ambrotype, and it doesn't really get attracted to the brass in the frame. So great way to know really quickly what you have. One thing to be aware with Tintypes is that they stuck around. So much like today, we live in an age, a post-Kindle age, where it was predicted that the books were done and we don't need them anymore because we can all read on our Kindle. But I think we can all agree that books are around and we still enjoy them. Photography after the Ambrotype and the Daguerreotype, both of which were somewhat expensive and difficult to make, becomes easier, and people stick with different media that they like a lot longer. So we have new things that we can try, but we still have old standbys that we can go back to. So this chart that is here on the PowerPoint you should be seeing right now says that the Tintype lasted around until 1878, but you do find them from as late as the 1920s. You would have itinerant photographers who could travel to carnivals and fairs and make a 10 type. And some people felt that they were a bit more long lasting or substantial than the next couple of types of photography. So we're going to move on to those and sort of talk about carte de visites and cabinet cards. So if I'm gonna scoot back a couple slides real quick to our handy description of a very brief history of photography. We mentioned Frederick Scott Archer and his collodion process, which involved glass plates. And then also he was followed in 1871 by Richard Leach Maddox, who invented gelatin dry plates or a silver bromide process. Both of these things allowed us to very easily print photographs onto paper and create paper images that were very portable and appealing to people, because you could have multiple images that you could share with your friends and family, that you could frame, that you could give away, that you could keep. And these were wonderful. So if we're thinking of photographs from the Civil War era or just after, for example, often what we think about are carte de visites or cabinet cards. And you're going to hear me moving around as I get some examples together. So carte de visites sound very fancy. What we're describing when I say carte de visite is the size of the image, not necessarily the media. When they were created, these lovely paper prints, there was an idea in the world that they could replace calling cards. So back in the day, in the 19th century and before, when you visited your friends, when you made your social calls, often you would go to someone's house, they wouldn't be home or available, and you would leave your calling card. And then they knew that they had to return a call for you. Usually these just had someone's name and you know, the times that they were at home or that they could be found at home. The idea behind the carte de visite originally was that, oh, wouldn't it be great if you just left your picture? So people show up and they can see, oh, hey, you know, so-and-so was here. This is what they look like. Maybe I do want to go visit them, maybe not. But let's take a look at some carte de visites. So here we have two from the Johnston collection again. These are very typical carte de visites. So what we have is familiar from our 10 types. We have a backing. In this case, it's cardboard. It's just paperboard, which is becoming a lot easier to get and more affordable in the 1850s and 1860s as people began to manufacture paper from tree pulp and other materials as opposed to just using rag paper. Now, we kind of hope from a preservation standpoint that they've used a quality paper like a rag paper, because tree pulp and early 19th century papers weren't great, so they tend to become acidic and brittle quite quickly. This looks like pretty good paper stock. On the front, we have another very, 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 very thin piece of photographic paper, which our image has actually been printed on. So I don't know if you can see the line here between the cardboard and the thin photographic paper. You'll also notice that this image is a little bit shiny. So what they would do is put a layer of albumin on top of the image to prevent it from being scratched and to make it a little bit more durable, a little bit more waterproof to a certain extent, and just look a little bit nicer. Now, albumin is something we all have in our homes. It's just egg whites. I mean, unless you don't eat eggs, but it was already in use by artists for many other things, and here it becomes basically a varnish. It also makes carte de visites and all of the paper-based photographs of this time that we're going to look at in a minute really tasty for bugs and other things, because it's an organic material. They kind of like it. It's like you've made a bug sandwich here of delicious paper, another delicious paper with some chemicals, and then a lovely egg wash to top it off. So carte de visites also enabled photographers to add advertisements. Unfortunately, I didn't pull any examples today that show advertisements on the carte de visites, but often you'll find printed on the back the photographer's name, their address, a fancy logo. And this is great because it helps us as people viewing the photograph later on to identify when the photograph may have been taken. In this case, someone very nicely has written the name of the individual on the photograph. It says McArthur, so we know this gentleman was probably McArthur. And then we have a little notation here that tells us that this was given to Celia. So we have sort of a history for this photograph. If we had the photographer's mark, we might be able to go research that photographer and kind of learn when they were located at that address, between what time. We could match that up with this information and maybe even locate our gentleman's first name, which would be lovely, and where he lived. The other thing that is great at this time and sort of a revelation is that we are able to do copy photography now. So you could, for the first time, preserve an older photograph or a painting. So sometimes you will come across something like this. This is from our new collection that we've almost finished processing, the Moffat collection. And it is a 19th century print of an earlier daguerreotype. So this is from a daguerreotype photograph, and they have just made a more modern print on board of it, which is great because in some ways this helps us sort of extend the life of those materials. And you do see people start to really copy a lot of photographs. Very similar to carte de visites are cabinet cards. My light is my friend and not my friend. That's true with photographs generally. So everything I've just said about carte de visites applies to cabinet cards, which are the size of photograph you see here. Once again, cardboard backing, very thin photograph layer. Here we can see this one is actually starting to lift off the back, unfortunately. You have space for the photographer to advertise. Let's see if we have any ads. Oh yes, wonderful ads. So here we have Wampler Excelsior Art Gallery in Charlottesville, Virginia, which is wonderful. And as I mentioned, we could go and see if Wampler moved around, when he used this logo, and there are books that collect that information. The other wonderful thing about these photographs and everything in the Moffat collection is they are to a T identified, which is the most important thing with photographs. Please identify your photographs. So in terms of studio photography, which we're talking about now, cabinet cards, carte de visites, and many other sizes. We're looking again at the roughly late 1850s to the early turn of the century. And these photographs all required you to go to a studio to sit and pose. You do see photographs outside at this time, but in general, when we're looking at these materials, they are being done by a professional photographer. And just a quick note about my slide, you know, photographers were professionals and they used tools at their disposal to make photographs as good as possible. And one thing that we have in our collection that I love to talk about is our little bird here. So if you've ever heard the phrase "smile for the birdie" said when someone's taking your picture, this is the birdie. So this was actually a steam or air operated whistle that photographers would have, that they could have this little bird twitter to distract children or other nervous sitters while they're being photographed and keep them still, sort of, or at least not crying. So I think it's a really great example of the photographer's art and some of their tools. So if you were going to a photographer, you could get your carte de visite, or you could even get larger sizes. And here we have a really quick rundown of the different sizes. Carte de visite, a Victoria, a cabinet card, all the way up to an Imperial, which is 9 7/8 by 7 7/8. So that's a pretty big print. And to give you an idea sort of what that looks like, I have here an example. This is an outdoor portrait of an organization. We have gentlemen seated. This is probably from closer to the turn of the century, just based on their boater hats here at the bottom. And this is close to an imperial size. It's a little hard to, I guess I need like a quarter or something here, for example, or a ruler. You can see in this photograph many of the challenges that face all of these paper-based photographs. In this case, this image has cracking, it has dents, it has areas where the cardboard has aged and the adhesive on the top layer of the photograph is starting to sort of peel off a little bit, which has caused some problems. We can see where there are abrasions. The photographic image has actually started to curl, unfortunately. And so this has some problems that we would need to go and see a conservator about. One thing to note about photographs at this time, so all of these studio photographs, late 19th, early 20th century photographs, is that there can be issues in the process itself. Improper washing, where they didn't get all of the chemical off of the paper, where their concretions were like the chemicals all sort of congregated in one section. And I don't know if you're going to be able to see, but you can kind of see here there's some areas where there's speckling and it's a little bit lighter. And I think this is actually maybe where something went wrong with the photographic process a little bit. It might not have been obvious right when the photograph was new and given to its purchaser, but over time these become more apparent as the materials age. The other thing that we'll often see too is silvering. So you can see in this print that we talked about being a copy of an older photograph, some silver mirroring in the corners here and sort of a blue cast. And that is often, again, an issue based in the chemicals that were originally used as they've aged. There's not much you can do about that, unfortunately, and that's where maybe making a surrogate of this image and then keeping it out of the light and safe, not handling it can actually be the best thing to do. One more quick example just to show you an outdoor photo from this time, because I know I've been talking about in the studio. Photographers did travel, they did go places. So you will see photographs of people outside, and there we need to know too that sometimes the photographer's environment or the lighting just wasn't the best. So the gentleman himself in the middle of this photograph is very clear and in great shape. However, the photograph around it is overexposed to a certain extent. So this is not damage to the image. This is just where the light in the photograph was a bit stronger. And also you can see, and it's again, probably a little difficult, there's actually a fingerprint in the top layer of the photograph here where someone maybe touched it a little too soon. Which is great. It's kind of neat to come across that because you get a sense of the person taking the photograph. So to this point, we have talked about all these different sizes and a little bit about how people started to adapt photography for different uses, like making copies of earlier photographs and things like that. But let's talk about really quickly a few of the more fun things they did that you may encounter, you might not. One of those that we have an example of in our hallway here at Thomas Balch Library is sort of collage photography or artistic uses of photography. So what we have here is a collection of carte de visites that were taken of a Confederate veterans camp. They were all then pinned to a board including both living and deceased members of the unit or group, and then photographed into a large, impressive photo. So since they couldn't get everybody together, they brought everybody together photographically. And you will see photographic collages of this on a much smaller scale, where you'll see family groups where someone has passed on. But they are still included in the photo sort of posthumously. They're kind of interesting, but they make them very hard to date. So if you are trying to say, oh, I know that person is Mr. Smith, and then that's Mr. Smith's wife, but this photograph looks like it was taken after this date, and that's impossible because she was dead. Well, she might have been. They may have included her either through photographic magic or not. We also at this time get into things like spirit photography, where people would play with the habit of photographs, where you could make double exposures, or you could add to negatives afterwards, or you could scratch off part of an image from a glass plate and then create another image on top of that, making layers of images. There's a really great book about a photographer named Mumler who specialized in spirit photography and creating these images. And he was a bit of a con artist, unfortunately, and he tricked a number of people, including, among others, Mary Todd Lincoln after the death of Abraham Lincoln. There's a really great book about it that I would highly recommend. And I'll include that in the notes we send out after the class. So another thing, type of sort of photography that might trick you a little bit into thinking it's something that it's not, is crayon portraits. And I don't usually include these, but I thought today I would, because they're a little bit different and they keep coming up. People keep asking us about them. So this is part of a crayon portrait. It's a very large portrait. And you can see here, if you came across this at first glance, you would be reasonably disposed to think it is a charcoal portrait of this woman. These were very popular starting in the 1880s through into the 1920s. And what it is a photographic image that has been printed onto board, and then an artist has gone in and added details like the hair. They've gone over it with a charcoal shading to sort of create more volume in the photograph. They've added a lovely blue-white hair accessory here. In some cases, they will do a little bit of cosmetic work to fix something in someone's face. They will add rosy tints. They'll draw in additional features, like maybe this necklace. I think this necklace is actually in the photograph, but I have seen ones where they added jewelry and sort of embellish it to make it into something that's more like a historic work of art. Now, these are sort of symptomatic of something that's happening with photography. When Daguerre first came out with the Daguerreotype, it was this amazing revelation because you no longer needed to have an artist's intervention or an artist's hand in creating an image of yourself. And now we're swinging back the other way because carte de visites and cabinet cards and other media have become so popular and so available and generally affordable that now people are looking for something that's a little bit more special. So if you're going to pay a photographer to take an image of yourself, it might as well be a portrait like you would get from an artist. And you could send away for these. These were sold, crayon portraits were sold door to door. Often you'll see that they come in these curved sort of oval frames. I have a great one of my great-grandfather as a baby. It is the giantest baby you've ever seen, but it is in an oval frame, which makes it very difficult to preserve because unfortunately, these were also produced on not great quality paper. So if you just take a look at the back here, we can see that this is sort of a dark cardboard. It says no frame, possibly because, it says it was removed from the frame, which may have been damaged. And with those curved frames, which this was not in, this was in a regular frame probably, the curved frames, the photo is shaped to fit the frame, so it can cause damage. And then if the frame is damaged and you need to replace it, it's very difficult. The other problem is this cardboard has become very brittle. So you can see where there are losses from the edge. And we also have the added benefit of not only having to deal with the photographic processes that are involved, so the chemicals on the paper, the cardboard of the base, but also we need to preserve the pencil, charcoal, and other artistic media that were applied to this. So we have to be very careful in storing these. One thing is you never want to put them in stacks or put something on top of a crayon portrait that has been removed from the frame. You also need to get special paper to store it in so that it stays safe and isn't damaged. You wouldn't want to put this, for instance, into a Mylar sleeve, such as you've seen me have other photographs in, because the static from the Mylar might take that charcoal layer off.
Laura, a question before you move on.
Okay.
You mentioned Mumbler. Around what years was he working?
So he sort of started right before the Civil War and then worked into, I believe, the 1870s. And I remember right from the excellent book, I don't think he came to a good end. So I don't think he was around after like 1880. And I will definitely send out the information about that book, because if you're interested in 19th century photography, it's a great overview of the topic, as well as him and his whole scam. But
Thank you.
yeah.
And then another question, what kind of paper is okay to use? I believe it is in reference to the crayon photos. Is acid-free archival paper appropriate?
So no, and actually this is the same thing has happened to me that always happens to me, unfortunately, where people ask me this question and the words for the paper go immediately out of my head. It is the sort of paper that you use with artwork, so that you would put cartoons or original drawings in, and I will think of it and I will tell you. Apologize. This always happens. It's more of a, and I can show you. Well, I will put it into the notes if I don't think of it before the end of the program. But it's actually more of a waxy paper. It's going to drive me crazy. This happened last class too. It's so embarrassing. But it's a waxy paper that is made specifically so it doesn't have a static cling and won't pull friable media, so powdery media like charcoal or pencil, off of the paper base. And I apologize for not being able to think of that. It happens every time. So,
it's the curse of the presenter, right?
It's just that one type of paper. It's really sad. Yeah, but those are great questions. Are there others?
Nope. Keep the questions coming as we move through. Those are great.
Okay, thank you. And that also gives me time to reach some things that are coming up. So we are about to move on into the history of photography, where you no longer need the studio photographer. So you probably all are familiar with the name Kodak. Eastman Kodak. It's still around, sort of, today, although maybe not what it once was. Around 1884, George Eastman invented flexible, paper-based photographic film. So why is this exciting for us? Well, if it is paper-based film that is flexible, that he later would put onto plastics, it is really portable and way more easy to maintain and use than our previous photographic media, like wet plate, where you had to keep the plate completely wet in chemicals until you developed the photo, or even dry plates, which were very laborious to make. Also, if you can imagine carting around glass plates just to take a photograph before you took the photograph, and then also after you took the photograph, you can imagine how difficult it was to actually go out and photograph the world as much as you wanted to. So in 1888, Eastman patented the Kodak roll film camera. So this was the first camera that was meant for just anybody to be able to become a photographer. And what this was you got for $25, you got a camera, which you can see in the photograph to the left there. That was sort of just kind of a box. It wasn't very appealing, but you got 100 preloaded roll negative, a preloaded roll of 100 shots of film. So you could immediately take 100 photos, and then you could then develop that yourself, or you could send it off to Eastman Kodak, and they would do the developing. Now, this is another revelation in the world of photography, because up to this point, if you wanted to develop your own photographs, you had to go to either trade catalogs or to someplace that would sell chemicals, which might even be just the apothecary in town, or the pharmacy, and have somewhat dangerous chemicals just like stored around your house. And you would have to have some knowledge to be able to do this, but people did. And we have some great examples in our collection of some amateur photographs from before Eastman Kodak, where people did pursue photography as a hobby and created some really fantastic images. And I've got two here. These are both photographs taken by Jenny Klein, and they're excellent because they show us two different types of photographic media that you could choose to work in. One is a Van Dyke print. So this is very similar to all of our carte visites and cabinet cards and other studio photographs. It's just the very thin piece of photographic paper without the cardboard backing. So you can see this was actually probably glued on an album at some point, but it's just the photographic paper layer, very thin, the image, and then she's done the albumin level layer to protect it. And it's a really lovely image of a cart and horse and a young lady. So it's an outdoor image. We see Jenny Klein in this case sort of exploring her world. The other thing that Jenny Klein worked in that I love are cyanotypes. So these are blue photographs, and you will come across them because they were somewhat popular, and they're probably of 19th century photography, one of the easier mediums that you could work in. Now, if you have ever made a sun print, which I definitely did in school as a kid, you have created basically a cyanotype. This is a media that first came around in the 1880s, and what it is it's iron salts as opposed to the silver salts that we've seen before, and it creates this beautiful blue image as opposed to a sort of darker or brown image. The problem with cyanotypes, though, is that they fade, unfortunately. And you also have issues here where we can see that maybe are more common in amateur photography than in studio photography, and that's where she didn't quite get something right with the chemicals. At the top here, yes, we have clouds and the blue sky, but there's some modeling and speckling. That is where I think possibly the chemical mixture coagulated or something didn't come out quite right. The other thing with cyanotypes is, again, like the Van Dyke print, because Jenny was not doing these for anyone but herself or her family, she didn't bother to put a more stable layer. These are just on very thin, very poor quality photographic paper. So we can see that it's browned, it's got staining possibly from chemicals. This one's been glued to something, but that was torn off. So these are very, very susceptible to damage because it's just a very thin piece of not super supple paper. So we definitely keep these in Mylar sleeves that will protect them from scratching, from the elements. We also, because the cyanotype is somewhat susceptible to light in terms of it continuing to fade, we definitely try to keep these out of the light. However, you may find all sorts of interesting amateur photographs in your 19th century photograph collections and early 20th photograph collections, because there were just oodles and oodles of people working and doing different sort of hobby photography. What happened though that sort of changed everything is once again down to Eastman Kodak, because in the 1890s, a gentleman named Hannibal Godwin patented celluloid film. So now you don't have to rely on paper film, which was prone to breaking and tearing and difficult to use. And Eastman Kodak also, about 2 years later, was like, hey, yeah, you know what? We're going to make photography even more available to the public. And we're going to focus our efforts and our audience on women and children, because we think that they would be really interested in photography. Up to this point, there was sort of an idea that photography was just for men. We obviously have examples in our collection here with Jenny Klein's photographs and other female photographers that say differently, that in fact women also enjoy doing photographs, but you know, that was the idea. So Eastman Kodak comes out and says, hey, no, we're gonna market a camera specifically to children. And that was the Brownie camera. So the Brownie camera, as you can see from the ad here, only cost $1. It came with, oh, I don't remember. I think it was just 10 shots preloaded, with the idea that you would then send them off to Kodak to be developed. You didn't have to do anything. You didn't have to load the film. You could, but you didn't have to. You didn't have to develop the film. All you had to do was push the button. And in fact, one of Kodak's taglines was, you push the button, we do the rest. Now you may be wondering what the brownies were. So you can see in the photograph these little tiny characters. These are in fact the brownies. They were one of the first marketing tie-ins aimed at children. So the brownies were from a very popular series of books by a gentleman named Palmer Cox, and they were used to sell everything. So if we think that product placement is bad today, it was just as bad at the turn of the century. So Eastman Kodak bought the rights from Palmer Cox just to slap the word brownie on this camera and to make it more appealing to children. The other thing that they did that I recently was learning about is they created a photo club. So if you bought a camera and you were a kid, you could join the photographers club, and then you could submit for a contest to win prizes and more film, things like that, which is kind of cool. Now let me just show you a couple of things about the Brownie camera that really changed things. So there's me. This is a Brownie camera from our collection. This is actually Jenny Klein's Brownie camera that she sort of moved up to after it was available. It's really easy to use. So you just have a little, instead of a button, it's actually a little switch that you open and close the shutter with. You can advance the film using this turn on the side. You use the viewfinder on the top here to take the photo. So honestly, often you'll see people and the photographs will be sort of weirdly waist height, like they were taken from somebody at waist height. And that's because people were actually holding the camera down so they could see in this tiny, not very good viewfinder right here. It didn't really offer much else in the way of adjusting the focus or anything else. It's very, you press the button, we'll do the rest. It did have this little handy handle that you could carry it out in the world with you, and it's a very portable size. So people could go anywhere, they could photograph anything, and they could easily get it developed. This was the first time ever that anybody could be a photographer, and boy did they really like it. So you see an explosion in photography at this time, and family records and other collections, because people for the first time were able to take photos of whatever they wanted, wherever they wanted. There was the issue still that you needed good lighting. And as time progressed, we developed lots of technology with flash bulbs and things like that that helped with that problem. But basically, after the introduction of the Brownie camera, we then see that the age of the snapshot. And let's just take a quick look at some snapshots, and then we're gonna really quickly move into 20th century photography so we can get to preservation. I know it's 11 o'clock. We will get to there. So let's look at some snapshots though, so we can just talk about how they are the same or different. And while I'm switching this, I'm going to tell you the interesting fact I recently learned about the origin of the word snapshot. So it was originally a term used by hunters, meaning a shot that you took with your gun at an animal without really aiming it, that actually maybe hit. So you took a snapshot, and with your gun, you could take a snapshot with your camera. So just a quick shot, and it's either good or it's not. You really don't know what you're taking. This phrase really caught on, and we still use it today, even though I think we all probably are a little bit better aware of what we're taking a photograph of with our digital cameras and our camera phones than they were with the Brownie camera, and it's sad, very hard to see viewfinder. So these are some examples of early 20th century to mid 20th century snapshots. So most of these are, like, I think the top 4 here are from the turn of the century, and the bottom 2 are from probably the 20s or 30s. So not much has changed in terms of our three layers of the photograph. We still have a thin paper layer, we have the photograph layer, and then in most of these we have some sort of protective top varnish layer. But we do see a couple things that are going to be indicative of this new era. One is that these are, with the exception of these 2 photographs, these are not standard sizes. People could cut and fold and artistically create with their photography now because it was reproducible. You had a negative, you could print another photo. So if you mess this one up, it doesn't matter. Or you can make as many copies as you want. And there were definitely companies that sprung up all over the country where you could just send your photos and they would just reproduce them for you. So now we can just go down to well, I mean, you can't really even go to the photomat or to the drugstore anymore necessarily and get reprints, but at this time, you could either print them yourself or you could mail them off to companies that often were in like Missouri, and they would send you reprints. But people kind of had fun with this. So you'll notice these 2 photographs. This one kind of mimics a studio photograph. This is a nice posed photograph outside. Both have been cut specifically to fit into a album. So you'll notice with a lot of snapshots, Brownie camera era photographs, the size of the photograph is not even. It's been trimmed, or it was just printed on paper that was not to a standard size. The other thing is that we noticed that maybe the chemical processes are not the best. So here we can see again a little bit of silvering. I think you can see it when I move the photograph at the bottom, where the chemicals in the top layer of the photograph are not stable. Another thing that you get into at this time that I love is people seem to just dote on these miniature versions of portrait photographs, these little thumbnail prints almost, and they will create all sorts of interesting collages. They will put them into jewelry. Here we just have like a little miniature collage where we have photographs of everybody. Unfortunately, you can see in some cases there's some losses to the tops of these photographs, possibly from where it was stored facing something else. And also we can see where in some cases the glue has started to damage a little bit the photographs that they use. We also have some discoloration there. I'm not sure if it was because it was framed or if that's from the original print. The other thing that's great about photographs at this time is you do see people out and enjoying this ability that they finally have to easily take photographs anywhere in the world. So here we have a farming scene. It looks like harvest is coming in that somebody has taken. Previously, you might come across images like this that were sort of artistic or taken for a mass market, or even that were used to be postcards. But this is actually a scene that someone has taken just of a familiar scene to them, I think, or of a scene that they wanted to capture. This is something that is being documented by them and not to be sold. Unfortunately, this photograph has some damage issues. I'm just going to point out so we can talk about how to avoid these later. You have rust marks where possibly it was in a frame or it had a paper clip at some point. And you also have some folds where the photographic layer is starting to crack because this image got folded at some point. So we definitely want to avoid ever folding or bending photographs. We really want to keep them flat. Just to round up, this is from a little bit later era of the Brownie camera. These are more mass-produced prints. So this is where you're sending it out to like the photomat, basically, or to Eastman Kodak. I'm not sure if this was produced by Eastman Kodak because it doesn't have any marking on the back. But we can see that this is a photographic paper that has been mass produced. So it has these lovely fancy edges. And these are very glossy, very standardized prints. So yes, people had the ability to print their own photographs and they could, but a lot of people chose not to, and you would get something more standardized. One problem that you can see with these is that unfortunately they have started curling, where just the paper has begun to age, desiccate, and possibly they were stored stacked or around something, and now they've got this curve. There are ways to relax this that I highly recommend investigating if you see photographs that are starting to curl. Sometimes just being stored in an appropriate storage, so flat or in a sleeve and good humidity will help solve that problem. Occasionally you'll encounter like panoramic photographs from this time that have been rolled, and those require some relaxing. And you can create humidification chambers, but I highly recommend if you need to do things like that, to seek a conservator to help you with it, because water and photographs do not mix, and we will talk about that. So after 1895, which is where we're at in our timeline, and I'm wrapping it up. I know you don't believe me, but I am. We find that candid photographs are easily available. Of course, as I mentioned before, that doesn't mean that people stop going to the photographer in the studio. They still did. That continues, and people get cabinet cards, they get carte visites, they get tintypes into the 1920s. They remain popular. You'll also see that there's a novelty and a nostalgia to it that people seek out. So often, like if they went to the fair or to Coney Island, they might get an older media, like a cabinet card of themselves, posing with the beautiful backdrop of the seaside or whatever, what have you. Studio photography kind of changes though a little bit, and I'm gonna ask you to bear with me really quickly while I gather some other photos here to show you. Okay, excellent, thank you. So the studio photography that we find around this time tends to be more in the line of gelatin prints. So let's look at a gelatin print really quickly. Okay, so you may have photographs like this in your personal collection. This looks a lot like our albumin prints before. It's got the same sort of sepia coloring. One way to tell that it's not is it isn't quite as shiny, and it's got sort of a more a different aspect to it that I don't think is going to come through on this camera. It's maybe a bit more stippled in some ways in the printing, because it's more of a photomechanical process than before. In this case, the photographer, which was in Frederick, Maryland, has created this nifty little frame for this item where it'll fold up and stand, so you can just display this. And you may come across images that are in these frames, and what you'll discover pretty quickly is they were never meant to be taken out. So this photograph, if we wanted to take it out of this frame, we would need to actually rip the frame very, very carefully. Why would we want to do that, you say? Well, you can see this adds yet another layer to our photograph. So at the top here, we have some foxing where this paper has begun to go a little bit bad. Just the chemicals used to manufacture the paper are starting to age and deteriorate. We also can see, and this is not great, and this is in our teaching collection, is that there's a little bit of signs that there used to be some mold maybe that grew on this frame. It's not there now, it's long gone, but it's left a little bit of staining. And if you look very carefully, you can see some dots on the front of the picture. Now, you heard me call this a gelatin print. So at this time, when we produced photos, as opposed to the egg-based wash that was put onto our cabinet cards and our carte visites, we've switched to something that is based off of gelatin. So, you know, like Jello. So it's a sticky, sort of pasty, clear substance that gets brushed over the top of the photo and dries and can make it very glossy. This is not so glossy. Unfortunately, much like albumin, and in some cases more so, gelatin is tasty, apparently, to mold. So you'll often see signs where mold has grown on gelatin prints, unfortunately. The other problem with gelatin prints is that if they get wet, they once again become sticky. So I don't know if you've ever encountered photographs that were in a flood or that got a little wet, maybe a packet from the photomat, but they will all stick together in one ginormous conglomerate. And if you don't catch them before they dry, you're kind of out of luck. So one thing that you can do if you have gelatin prints or photomat prints that get wet or get in a flood is freeze them, which allows you time to go and contact a conservator or to prepare what you need to do to fix them. So just moving forward in our timeline so we can finish up, we're going to kind of diverge because after 1914, the 35mm still camera gets developed. And this is something that I think probably most of the people in the audience are more familiar with. So this is a still camera with roll film on a plastic media that you can easily make your snaps and that you can improve upon your image with. So unlike the Brownie camera that was, you press the button, we'll do the rest, and hopefully you're in good sunlight and the image comes out well and you're not trying to take a photograph at night because it's just not going to work. With the 35mm still camera, people could develop all sorts of things to help. So General Electric invents a modern flash bulb, multiple flash bulbs continue, and then we get into fabulous things like color. So color does exist in photographs before 1935, but 1935 is when Eastman Kodak first marketed Kodachrome. And the thing is, as soon as they start trying to add color to film, they want to improve it and make it much better. And so they just play around with all sorts of chemicals, which unfortunately means that color film has many, many, many problems because it's not as stable. We've added more chemicals into the mix. The dyes can become fugitive. They can interact with the photographic media. There are all sorts of different things that go on as we develop color. Similarly, we have throughout this time been making photographs faster and faster to produce. So you start with a 30-minute wait as you sit very still for your daguerreotype image just to be captured on the plate, down to the snapshot where we just snap a button and then we have to mail it off for a week or two so Kodak can produce it or drop it off or do the developing ourselves. People want it to be instantaneous from the very beginning. In fact, Daguerreotype himself is recorded, Daguerre himself is recorded as being like he thought that the Daguerreotype should just be instant. It was not. So in 1948, Edwin Land actually produced a Polaroid camera, which the idea was this is a camera that develops the film itself. So the first Polaroids were black and white, and then they later became color. So let's see here. I'm going to talk about the different media from this era really quickly, and then we're going to move on to digital really, really quickly. When we're talking about gelatin prints, photographs from the 35mm period, we are looking at photographs that look something like this. This is a less common example than what you may have. You may find photographs of this size in your collection, but this is a newspaper photograph. So this is from the Loudon Times Mirror collection. that we have here at the Thomas Balch Library that is currently being processed, and we're very excited to be able to process it because it has tons of wonderful images like this that are all basically produced on as silver gelatin prints. So this is, again, a silver-based photographic media on paper, which is very standardized at this point in terms of photographic paper. And it's got that glossy gelatin layer that I mentioned. You can see it. You see the difference, though, between the albumin and the gelatin? We're going to look really quickly. So here's our albumin, and you see that it's a little bit shiny, but it's kind of muted, the shininess. Gelatin is shiny. And of course they had matte prints where it's actually like basically a pattern that is impressed into the wet gelatin, and later chemical processes that did that. But generally it's this glossy look. So if it's glossy, be careful to avoid moisture, even just high humidity, because that means it's going to get sticky. Also, the thing to know about papers at this time is they have started to do things to make it smoother or more easily available. So they add things like plastics and different chemicals to make it more supple or sturdier. So there are more chemicals at play here than just the photographic media. The other thing that we find now that we're in the age of people being able to create photographs themselves are negatives. So we're just going to look really quickly at some negatives that aren't going to look like much on my charming black background. So we'll put a folder in here. Yeah, there we go. It still just looks like a black piece of plastic because that's what it is. So photographic negatives, probably in most collections today are going to be a little bit smaller than this. You may be used to the strips of negatives that you used to get back with your photographs from the photomat, and we all probably have those. But what it is your photographic image on a plastic media that lets the light be projected through it. This one not so much. It's pretty dark. Let's see. No, it's not going to show up, so we'll just put that one over here. For earlier photographic film, say before 1920, you will encounter nitrate negatives in some cases, and you need to be very careful if you do find nitrate negatives because it's a highly flammable media. It's often been a plot line in television shows and movies where the nitrate negative stock bursts into flame or blows up or is blown up on purpose. It's really not that dangerous, but it does have the ability to spontaneously combust on its own. So most archives tend to be very hesitant to collect it and will often digitize nitrate negatives just to not have them in our collection and then discard the originals. It's also a problem with motion picture film stock, and you do have to be very careful. It's why in some cases old negative film is stored in bunkers or in safes just to prevent fire hazards. You most likely do not have nitrate negatives in your collections. What you probably have are acetate negatives, or what is known later as safety film. And I don't know if you're going to be able to see it, but we're going to hold this up anyway and pretend you can. In the top corner, you're going to see that it says Kodak and then safety, because this is safety film. And it was specifically produced to avoid that unfortunate combustibility of nitrate and to let people know this is a safe negative film. Now, negatives are, if possible, because they are on a plastic media at this time, the least stable thing that you're going to encounter in your photograph collection. So what you have are the photographic chemicals in the image layer degrading, and then also you have the plastic degrading. And just very quickly, it's going to lead to things, unfortunately, that look like this. So plastic is never stable. We do have chemically stable plastics that are produced for archival storage, like mylar and polyesters, but generally the plastics that were used to produce photographic negatives are not stable. So you get things like this bubbling where the image layer is still there, but the different layers of plastic are starting to come apart. Now, how do you know if your negatives are going bad? One thing that you can immediately tell is that they have a very unfortunate sour milk smell that becomes more prevalent and noticeable with variations in temperature or humidity. So if it warms up and suddenly you notice that there's a smell coming from the photograph cabinet or wherever you keep your photographs, it's probably negatives that are going off. It's definitely more common with negatives from the first half or the mid to late 20th century. When you get into the 90s, the 80s and 90s, the plastics being used change a little bit and they don't really smell before they just go bad. So one thing to do with negatives is most likely just go ahead and digitize them if you can, reproduce them, or if you have the prints, maybe don't worry about it. If you don't have the image, reproduce it in some way. If you do, consider whether you really need to store the negatives. I just want to talk really carefully, quickly about color prints and Polaroids in particular. We're just going to look at one early Polaroid, color Polaroid that we have in our collection. Again, from the fabulous Johnston collection. The Johnstons and the Kleins were they were all great photographers who kept their photos in great shape. So we have many examples, but this is a very early Polaroid from around 1973. And it has on the back the labels that let us know this is Polaroid. So it's an original Polaroid land photograph. It has a space to write in the subject and the date and all of that, which is fantastic. It even gives you places to check when you reorder copies. Isn't that handy? So you can definitely spend more money and order copies. But the benefit of the Polaroid was that you immediately got to see this image. So this is one of the ones that I don't know who's in the audience, but some of you may have had the experience of you actually had to pull off a sheet of plastic from the top, and you can see these sort of raw edges from that are left, and you would get your image. I'm personally, full disclosure, from the Polaroid, it comes out of the camera and you shake it for no reason. Sorry, that was disturbing. The shaking does nothing, but it made us all feel a lot better, but it develops as you watch. Now, the problem with all Polaroid and instant developed film developed in the camera film is that it continues to develop forever. There's no way to stop this. So all of the other media we have looked at up to this point, the photograph is put onto the image is put onto the photographic paper in the developing process, and then it is put on into a stabilizing chemical that stops the developing process. Not so with our lovely Polaroids. It is implicit in the material, so it just continues to develop. You will see in the background of this that you've got lighter areas. There's sort of like a halo almost coming through in this image, where it is continuing to develop. The edges are going to get lighter and lighter and lighter, and eventually the image will go away. So the thing that you want to do with a Polaroid, if you have them and you need the image, is to reproduce it, either by digitization or creating another photograph of it. So it's not forever. They're excellent. They're really cool. And I love that you can see the color images in here and how the color was being worked on. So you get these reds and greens were really revolutionary at the time, but it's not forever. So you definitely need to be careful to reproduce it. Similarly, and just very quickly, because you're not going to see anything, it's just going to look like a slide, or slides. So these are Kodak slides from I think these are actually from the 80s, but they look a little bit earlier. So this is Ektachrome, which is another color medium that was produced by Kodak. These are actually lovely flower prints, and we did a slideshow of some of the images from this series of slides that's available on our YouTube channel. What Slides did was just make it easy for you to share your photographs. And the thing is, you will find slides of all ages in your collections. You may even find glass plates that were meant to be projected from a magic lantern. Because these are media that require projection, what is probably the best idea if you want to easily access the material is to digitize them. Unfortunately, it's getting increasingly difficult to find a slide projector in the wild that works. So if you don't already have one and you're not willing to invest in replacement parts for it, go ahead and reproduce the images so you can access that material. I'm happy to talk to you about it and how we do it. But it's going to be, it will be an amazing shift if they begin to produce slide projectors again. It's probably unlikely. There are several apps that you can get for your phone that will just let you click and shoot. I have a couple that I've played around with and been relatively pleased with. You don't get a super high quality image, but if you just want to know what's on the slide without investing in a light box or squinting and holding it up to your ceiling light, they're worthwhile. And you can really quickly create a digital surrogate for slides that way. So I am talking a lot about digital photography, and we're going to go there now. So one of the things that I think we all take for granted is that still photography is still something that was the only thing we had when we were kids, which is not true. So digital photography was actually first produced in the 70s. It did not become something that we could actually use or have in our pockets until much later. But the inventor of digital photography passed away, unfortunately, last year. And here you can see the original digital camera, and I love it because it produced an image, it captured the image on these cassette tapes, which is really cool. So you can have a little bit of more of a time frame. So the first commercial digital camera came out in 1984. Pixar, which we now know for different things, was producing digital imaging processors in 1985, and then it all sort of goes from there. So by the 90s, we're all able to start capturing easily photographs digitally. I was always shocked to remember that 1999 is the first time that you could take a photo with a camera phone. This presents completely different problems than what we're used to. So now there is no media. The media is ones and zeros, it's binary code, and it's whatever you have stored your digital image on. So one thing that I have to highly recommend is whatever you have your digital images stored on is to go through a process of triage. So look at your digital photos, and if you're like me, as I mentioned, I have like 5,000 on my phone right now. Consider the ones that you want to save and then store them in multiple locations digitally. The best storage media for digital photos that's used by most archives is a TIFF file, a TIFF, because they are the most stable, the media that has the most information, the sort of format that has the most information in the file format, and also they're portable. Another file format that you can save things as is a PDF, because those are things that can continue to be read. JPEGs are great. They are also okay. It's just TIFFs have more information in them. What I do not recommend is printing out all of your digital photos, and here is why. So these are both digital photos that I took around 2005. I printed this one in 2008. It's a commercial photo print, so I took it to the photomat. It's on Kodak paper, which you'd think would be great, but what has happened is to these fairly recent photos, I realize it's like almost 20 years now, and I don't want to think about it because that makes me feel old. But what has happened in the interceding 15 years or so is that the pigments in both of these photos, this one is printed on just regular acid-free copy paper, and here you can see the blue mark, which is an acid testing friend, pen. Blue means it's acid-free. The pigments that were used to print the photos, which are basically inkjet printer pigments like you use in your inkjet printer at home in 2005. The same thing was being used at the photomat. It wasn't different. And this is what happens over time. The colors in the pigments become really super fugitive. So your best bet is to preserve the image digitally and to store it in multiple locations so that if your one photo service goes down, then there's a backup. The other thing is to not store your digital photos on external media like USB drives, because unfortunately they're super unstable. Ditto with CD-ROMs and DVD-ROMs. Those are unstable media. So storing it, I usually do not suggest people put things in the cloud, but storing things in the cloud in this case is one of your best options. So if I haven't bummed you out enough with that, let's go and talk a little bit about just identifying photographs further, and again with an eye towards preserving them specifically. So there are some great tools out there. One is also the graphics atlas, and what the graphics atlas does is it helps you look at the image very closely using a magnifying glass or even just zooming in on your cell phone, and based on how the image is produced, like what the grain or the stippling looks like, it can tell you what type of image it is, what type of media. It's helpful not just for photographs but also for printed media. So if you have artwork in your house that you're not really sure what it is, if it's a print or a halftone or a lithograph, if this is a great resource. So I highly recommend you explore that. And I will provide the link elsewhere so you don't have to hurry and scramble to write it down. Other things to look at are just basic characteristics. So is it shiny like a mirror? It's probably a daguerreotype. Can you only see it from one angle? It's probably a daguerreotype. I don't recommend opening up your daguerreotypes to look at the back, but if you happen to be able to see the back and it looks like copper, it's probably a daguerreotype that they only plated the front of. We talked a little bit about the ambrotype, where if it has holes, if you can see holes that are darker, it might be an ambrotype where you can see through the background. If it's on a glass plate, that's an ambrotype. I didn't bring out any glass plates to show you because it just it makes me kind of nervous to handle them. And they're so easily scratched. But if you have glass plates in your collection, which you may, it's most likely the Ambrotype process, unless it's a later production. Sometimes Ambrotypes will also kind of look a little bit 3D or have a bit of depth to them. Tintypes, we talked about using a magnet to see if it's a tintype. If it has an iron plate, if you can see rust, that's a really good chance it's a tintype. Cabinet cards and carte de visites, two of the other most common early photographic media. It's going to be a thin card mounted on something more stable. The other thing that you can do to date photographs is look at clothing. So in the background of this slide is a really beautiful tiny album of what's called gem prints. So these were extremely tiny postage stamp sized tintypes that are put in a purpose-made album. There are 4 to a page, and they're the size of a postage stamp. But this item, which is in our Constance Williams de Bordenave collection, has the most exquisitely dressed young ladies in it. So you can see kind of in the corner, this lady has a really elaborate hat. They were very fashion forward. And given that, we're able to very easily date this album to the early 1860s, so about 1863. There are some wonderful resources out there. The Costume Institute, the Library of Congress has numerous pictures that have been collected so you can identify clothing. And I cannot recommend enough the book Dress for the Photographer, Ordinary Americans in Fashion in 1840 to 1900 by Joan L. Severa. It's a wonderful resource where she has taken different types of clothing and sort of arranged it to show how it changed over time. It's even great for men's clothing, which doesn't change as rapidly as women's, but she points out things that you can look for that can help you date photographs. So finally, we've made it to preservation, and I promise we will cover it all. Generally, I feel like in teaching this class that I give you a lot of disaster and things that can go wrong, and I don't have very good fixes and solutions for it. But there are three concepts that if you stick to, you can really easily make the decisions that'll help you decide what's worth paying a conservator to work on, what's you can preserve yourself, and what is a lost cause. So the first is conservation versus preservation. Conservation is where you have to go in and interact with the material that makes up the item itself in a way that will irreparably change it. Probably for the better, but it's going to be different. So things that we talked about, like replacing the glass in a daguerreotype, or relaxing the fibers in a photograph so it can be unrolled. Those are things that you cannot really undo once you have done them. So that's something that a conservator should do for you. Preservation is things like using mylar sleeves to prevent the top of your albumin prints from being scratched, or storing things in the appropriate climate. Those are things that you can do that are fairly easy. Sometimes there's a little bit of an investment involved, but they will extend the lifetime of your item. They might not fix the cracks and scratches and tears, but they will keep further damage from happening. This leads to the second concept, which is do no harm. Do not do things that you cannot undo. One example that we may talk about is working with magnetic albums. So we have them, those albums with the sticky pages where it has a plastic cover that goes over it. The thing that happens with those is your photo first becomes irreparably sealed to the page as the adhesive ages and the plastic on top ages, and it becomes like this unfortunate plastic goo, like a conglomeration that you can't undo. As the plastic continues to age, it becomes cracked, and the chemicals in it seep into your photographs, and then the adhesive starts to give up. What you want to do if you have images in a magnetic album is take them out. If you can, you may not be able to. So if you start to remove those images and you find that the photographs won't become unstuck, don't do it. Stop. If you feel like you're going to tear a photograph, don't do it, because you cannot. You can undo it, but it may cost you lots and lots of money. And there are certainly things that you can do with photographs that you cannot undo. So interacting with chemicals or glues, adding anything to them. And unfortunately, if you cannot easily undo it without other chemicals, you should never do it to your photographs. The third concept is intrinsic value versus informational value. So with photographs, this becomes a difficult conversation because they exist in most cases after our Ambrotype era. They are made to be reproduced. So you may have multiple copies that exist of a photograph. So any individual copy has informational value. You can see the picture, you can understand what was in the picture, but maybe the print itself is not intrinsically valuable. It can be replaced. However, there are definitely photographs that cannot be replaced through the entire time frame of photography. So daguerreotypes we talked about, they are one of. We can make a digital image of it, but it's never going to be as good as the original daguerreotype. It's never going to have the same photographic quality, unfortunately. And as they're little gems that are beautifully presented to us, and we have to preserve the original to really capture all of the information and value that is there. Now, snapshots that I took in 2008, again, I can have as a digital file, I can move that digital file, I can endlessly copy that digital file, I can copy the original photograph, I can make all sorts of new prints. The information from that is continuously captured, so maybe I don't need the sad, really gross looking printed copy. I can get rid of it. The reason this is important in preservation of your photographs is identifying whether the item itself needs to be preserved or just the information from it can really help you determine if reformatting a photograph is the best way to go. If digitizing it and then printing it on a use copy or a copy to just go forward is a better solution than trying to preserve the original. And if you have negatives, you have the option then to digitize the negatives and then make as many prints as you want. You have the option to preserve those negatives and have to deal with the plastic as it ages. So looking at what you feel you want to preserve and making that judgment call that only you can make about whether this item itself needs to be preserved or just the image in the photograph needs to be preserved is something you want to ask yourself before you even dive in to preserving things. The problem is that by their very media, photographs are going to go bad. So they're made by two things, light and then time as the image develops. Both of these things are going to work against you if you as you retain your photographs. So images are going to fade and your memories are going to fade. So I do not remember where I found this yellow bicycle photo, but here it is. And I could have written it down. The main thing I highly recommend is if you have photographs that are unidentified that you can identify, please identify them. And the way to identify them is to use a non-photo blue pencil to write on the back of the photo very lightly, or to put your photographs into a container like a sleeve or a folder, or to include a piece of paper with them that includes the information about the photograph. You don't want to write on your photographs with anything that is a pen or a marker. Even the archival pens, although they're made to do just that, to mark onto materials permanently. They're not great because ink can become fugitive. It's also a chemical that you're adding in that's going to age. So here is a non-photo blue pencil. It looks exactly like a blue colored pencil. What a non-photo blue pencil is that it is a stable type of pencil. It's a very, very soft lead that has this lovely blue. This blue will not reproduce if you photographically. So if you photograph the image, it will not print onto the photograph. It also will not rub off on a photograph that the photograph is stacked on top of. It's the light lead that's very soft, lets you write on things without bearing down. It won't dent your photographs. So it's a great idea to use. People have asked me, well, can I just use a number 2 pencil or another soft lead pencil? You can, but the lead, the graphite is going to be very friable. I don't recommend it. I really do. It's worth paying the buck or two for the pencil. The other thing that you can do is just create a catalog of your photographs. So that's basically what we do here. We describe the photographs into our Past Perfect catalog. Each photograph gets a number, and then there's the description, and the number can help you find the photograph. In terms of fading images,
Laura?
yeah.
Sorry, where can those blue pencils be purchased? Is that something that's available at Michael's, or does it need to be purchased through an archival company?
So you can sometimes, it's a great question. You can sometimes find them at Michael's or other like craft supply, scrapbooking supply places, but increasingly I find that you have to kind of order them from archival supply companies. And you can just buy them on Amazon. What you want to look for is, this is a Prismacolor, but you want to look for a non-photo blue pencil. I have found them just on Amazon before. We generally get ours from an archival supplier like Gaylord Brothers or Conservation Resources or University Products. There's a number out there, and I have some information about that coming up. So the thing that you want to do if you have fading images is to look at the media. And one place that you can go to that we're not going to go look at, but I highly recommend, is the imagepermanenceinstitute.org. And what they have is a giant catalog of image deterioration. So it can tell you what type of image you have based on you comparing it with their images. And then also things that you can do to, the things that might be going wrong with it and what you can do to slow that down. It's a really fantastic resource. It's also a great place to go if you are looking for information about supplies, materials for storing your collections. So the Image Permanence Institute is one of the organizations that helps vet archival storage materials. So The other things you can do is go ahead and remove things that are going to be problematic. So if you attended my colleague Gabby Sanchez's program last month, you've heard this all before, because it's the same for photographs as it is for all other paper objects. One thing you want to avoid is any sort of pressure sensitive tape. If your photograph is torn, do not put tape on it or glue. Any adhesive you add is going to further add to this wonderful chemical soup that we have on photographs and can cause problems. Pressure sensitive tapes generally will at minimum cause staining. At maximum, they will cause extensive damage and can stick to other things and create a huge mess. So it's just best to avoid them entirely. Rust, similarly, in some photographic media like tintypes, definitely it's part of the material itself, but we don't want to add anything else in that's going to cause that problem. So you don't want to include metal fasteners of any kind in your photo storage. So it's very tempting to paperclip labels onto photographs, because I've just told you not to write on them unless you use a special pencil. But you do not want to do that. And if you do use clips, plastic clips are okay for most paper media, but with photographs, they can actually lend to cracking and tearing of the photograph. So it's best just to avoid fasteners, honestly. The way to do it is to make folders out of acid-free, very stable paper, or to store things in sleeves. You can get notebooks that have sleeves, lots of sleeves pockets in them. So those are a great way to go. The other thing that is an amazing enemy of photographs is moisture. You definitely want to store your photographs in a cool, dry environment that is not conducive to flooding or extra moisture and the production of mold. So this is a photograph that has mold damage, and it's just, you can see it's just eaten away. This is one of those gelatin prints that I told you mold finds so tasty. It'll just eat away your images, and there's not much you can do about that, unfortunately, once it's gone. So in terms of handling photographs, you definitely want to do, as I've done during this presentation, although it can make it difficult to open sleeves, is to have clean hands. Wash your hands or wear non-scratching microfiber or nitrile gloves. So just keep your dirty hands off the photographs. The oils on your hands will damage them. Have a clean work area, keep food and drink away, and just start with a clean area. Before I work with photographs, I do try to either put down clean archival board or just a folder that is clean, so I'm not transferring anything from the tabletop onto the photographs. You never know when there's cleaner just still on the table that might damage something. Again, use a non-photo safe pencil. Write only on the reverse of the image. Do label your photographs, though. Please tell us who are in these images. There is a sea of unidentified photographs out there that are unfortunate, because once the people who knew who that person was in their lifetime are gone, it's so difficult to identify them, especially if they are removed from the context. Like if you've ever been to an antique store and seen the sad box of photographs that are there that are unidentified, you know what I mean. Don't use paper clips or other fasteners. Organizing your prints in boxes is great. You just avoid sticking them together with things. Rubber bands, self-adhesive tape, glue, any other adhesives are never great. So when we're talking about albums, you have ones that have sleeves, and those can be okay. You want to look for the materials that have passed the photographic activity test, and I have a slide about that coming up. Or, the adhesive corners, the little like corners that you see in old-timey albums can actually be pretty good. They have a adhesive, so that's not great, but that adhesive is water soluble, so it's easy to remove if it did get stuck to your photograph. Very carefully, and possibly with a conservator. But generally, if you can avoid adding any of those things into your collections, it is great. So storing your photographs is the most important thing you can do. You usually want to store your photographs at a stable environment. So that means where you were comfortable. So approximately 70 degrees and 55% humidity is what we're recommending here. You will see much lower temperatures out there in literature. The reason we're saying 70 degrees and 55% relative humidity is that that is actually achievable in most of the continental United States most of the time. And it's kind of where a lot of us are comfortable. Higher than that is just too hot. Lower than that, it's difficult to maintain and be a human being who lives there. Relative humidity is the most important factor. So as we've mentioned, moisture is not your friend. So you want to keep it dry. If you can make a space in your house that stays between 30 and 40% relative humidity most of the year, if you have central air and heat, go for it. It's great. That is wonderful for your prints. And the cooler you can do is better. But what is most important is that it's stable. And that's why we say something that is maintainable. If you have vast rises and dips in temperature, your photographs are going to expand and contract, and that's going to cause damage and start photographic layers from separating from the paper layer. It's going to cause the acid in the paper layer to become fugitive. It's going to become the chemicals to maybe start reacting at a faster pace and cause all sorts of problems. If you have color film or film negatives and you have the ability to, it is ideal to store those at a much lower temperature. So often you will see people put those into refrigeration. So 40 degrees or lower. There are enclosures available that you need to put those materials in, and you need to look for refrigeration that does not have a lot of moisture to it. If you are interested and able to do that, and you have like large collections of color photographs and film negatives that you definitely want to preserve the original, please reach out to me and I'd be happy to provide you with information about that. You should never, ever, ever, ever put photographs in attics or basements, ever, because they are prone to water disasters and other problems. You want to avoid sources of heat, so don't put your photographs right next to the radiator or right next to a vent or right next to a window. Avoid direct light exposure. Basically, if you can keep your photographs in the dark, it's really the best thing for them, which is unfortunate because, we want to look at them. If you store your photographs in containers, I recommend using paper containers. However, I understand that a lot of people will store things in plastic containers. Regardless, do not put them directly on the floor because that makes them more prone to moisture. And then you want to keep your area clean because dirt, dust, and bugs are all things that are going to damage photographs long term. So just keeping them out of the area is ideal. In terms of the photographic material I mentioned, again, acid-free boxes are great for all of your archival materials, historic things that you want to save. Any materials that you store photographs in, the best practice is to look for things that have passed the ANSI Photographic Activity Test, or PAT. What that says is that they are non-reactive with the chemicals that are normally found in photographic materials, and that they are also stable, so they're not degrading at a rapid rate. If you've ever looked at old photo sleeves and noticed that they're yellowing or starting to become kind of brittle, those are not stable, and you definitely want to take your photographs out of them. So paper enclosures, in addition to being acid-free, should also be lignin-free, or unbuffered stock. Most paper actually today a lot of paper is acid-free. It's worth it for photographs to go out of your way to purchase things that are identified as lignin-free and unbuffered. So we talked a little bit at the beginning with the daguerreotypes about paper enclosures. But you can also make them very simply out of acid-free paper. Archival supply companies, which I'll give you some later, also make silver-safe paper that is made for photographs like your silver gelatin prints, all of your photographic media that use silver salts. There's a bit more here about plastics. Again, the plastic enclosures that archives use tend to be uncoated polyesters. So things like Mylar, polyethylene, polypropylene. If you have a question about a photographic enclosure, I'm happy to provide information later about that if you email me. You don't want to put plastic enclosures on things like glass plates or nitrate or acetate based negatives. Those you definitely want to use paper for. It's also not always a great idea to put them on On 10 types, if the 10 types are flaking, so if the top photo layer has started to come off, it's probably a better idea to store that also in a paper sleeve. We always separate our negatives from our printed photographs because they, as we saw, they are largely plastic, and they're going to continue to off-gas and age. So they are doing different things than your paper printed photograph. So keeping them separate just keeps them from causing problems amongst each other. And finally, for some photographs like case photographs, daguerreotypes, ambrotypes, and 10 types, it's ideal to store those flat. Also, any large photographs like the crayon portrait that we saw, definitely you want to store flat, and you want to avoid stacking anything on top of it because that can lead to cracking. And I have seen photographs, large format photographs, particularly that were printed on bad quality paper or have bad quality backing, just shatter because something was put on top of it. So ideally, lay it flat, don't put anything on top of it. So albums and scrapbooks, I talked about a little bit already. And they present numerous other problems. So in our practice here is what we generally do if we need to preserve a album is go ahead and document it as it is laid out. If the materials in the album or scrapbook are going to damage the photographs, such as with the magnetic albums that I mentioned, we will go ahead and pull images out of it. Again, document what it looks like because sometimes the placement of the images tells you about who, what, when, where of that photograph, but if it's going to continue to damage them, it's better to remove them. This is something, again, that you can seek out a conservator to do, or if the images come out easily, such as those, if your magnetic album is still tactile, like sticky, you can still actually carefully pull the images out without damaging them, it's worth it to go ahead and do that. Now, once you do remove images from one of those magnetic albums, it's an ideal thing not to stack them immediately because often they will bring adhesive with them. So the backs will remain sticky and tacky. And sometimes you can stack them together and they will tear. What's a great idea is if you do that is to go ahead and put them in sleeves or to separate them with paper until you're able to store them in something. The other thing that is good to know about these black paper albums, like the one on the screen now, is that that paper often contains some nasty chemicals, things like sulfur and other dyes that can damage your photographs. Generally, if you look at a photograph album and the photographs look okay, it's probably okay to store in them, but I would definitely recommend going ahead and documenting those by scanning it or even just taking some quick photographs of it in case things go south. The other thing is you can kind of tell with this album it has facing pages where the photographs are touching each other when the book is closed. If that's the case, what you want to do is take some acid-free, lignin-free tissue and just layer it in between the pages to prevent those photographs from touching. That's going to help you out if there's too much moisture in the air or if there's ever a flood, so the photographs won't stick together. They're also not going to scratch each other, which is another reason why we generally do, if possible, take albums apart, just because everything's rubbing against each other in there. So magnetic albums with a Polaroid photograph in it. It's just so many problems. We talked about these again. If you can carefully remove the photographs, it's ideal to go ahead and do it. If not, again, I recommend just documenting that album. So we all want to show off our photographs. They are awesome and they are really fun to share with people and to see and to enjoy. However, when displaying them, what is best? Best practice, hands down, is to make a surrogate. So make a reproduction image and then display that reproduction. Keep your original safely stored away in the dark and put the copy out. No one will know really. Unless it's a daguerreotype, you're not going to really lose anything from that image, and you're going to prevent light exposure from your displaying of the photograph. Now, you also want to be careful, though, if you do display an original photograph, that the materials you use to display it, again, are archival or museum quality and pass that PAT test. And you can definitely ask your framer about that. They should be able to provide information about what they're using and the materials. And also, if you would like some conservation framing guidelines, I have a great bit of information I'd be happy to share with you. Although I highly recommend just not displaying the originals. It's just better. It's just better not to. Okay, so I've talked a lot about making digital surrogates, and you may think, oh, great, digital's the way to go. I'm going to totally put everything digital. Well, again, when you make a digital photograph, you're not necessarily solving all of your problems. You're actually just making new problems that are fun too. But it is a way to go to preserve that informational value. So first, you want to identify where all of your digital photos are. So you are like me, you probably have them in a million different places. Once you've identified those that you need and want to save, you need to create 2 backup files, store them 2 separate places, and a great idea is to even give one away. So maybe put it on an external hard drive and give it to a friend who lives in another city, or give it to a relative. And then you want to actively manage your archives. You need to check on them, including the backup that you gave away, periodically to make sure that the drive still works, or if they're in the cloud, that the data is still good, know where they are, make sure that everything works, and you're going to have to migrate them over time. So there is cost to creating digital images. It is not free, and you do have to know that you're now going to have to maintain that surrogate digital image in perpetuity, as well as your original that you're trying to save that way, if you keep both. We could do a whole class about scanning, and we have, and it was great. And if I can get the wonderful speaker we had, Gina McNeely, back, I will do so in a heartbeat to talk about scanning again. And also, hopefully someday we could do a class about digital materials, but it's a whole different topic. That I'm happy to help you with if you have questions, but I can't cover it here because I've already gone over time. Wrapping it up, tools and supplies. I know I just said I went over time, but I'm gonna just show you really quickly our handy kit that you can buy. So we do sell a home archives kit for the preservation of your home archives. It's $45, and you can just request it by emailing us, responding to the emails you got about the class, or when we send out the video and the class information, that's the handouts. What you get is an archival storage box. It's acid-free. You get a selection of acid-free paper, Mylar sleeves, your own white cotton gloves. You get an eraser. This is a Mars plastic eraser, which means that it doesn't create a lot of eraser dust when you erase, and it will also generally not damage things. It is great not only for erasing pencil and marks like that, but also for removing some adhesive. If like your magnetic photo album left goo all over the back, you can use a Mars eraser or a gum eraser to very lightly and carefully remove some of that stickiness. It's not going to be perfect, but it's going to get some of the immediate stickiness off of it. It also comes with an archival spatula. So this is actually a surgical tool that archivists use. It's really cool. It's helpful for removing staples. You can pry up the prongs and pull them out. It's also great for if you have photos in those magnetic albums, carefully sliding under the photo to break that adhesive seal so you can get them out. It's really handy. It's good too if you have photographs that are just slightly stuck together but not super stuck together. You can lightly try to separate them. So very handy tool. You get the non-photo blue pencil, and also we have some sleeves for negatives and other things like that, in addition to some archival folders. If you're just getting started with this, you're not sure what you need or how you want to proceed, this can be a good way to go if you just have a small number of photos to preserve. Again, you can just contact us and we'll send out some information about it. Other thing.
So we have a question.
Okay.
Is it okay to store photos in the basement if you can maintain that 70 degrees and 55% humidity? How important is air circulation, or is it just a never store your photos in the basement?
So if your basement is climate controlled and you don't live in a floodplain or a very humid area, Sure. I mean, if you have I mean, our archival, our offices here are in a basement. It's just ideally you don't want to save it and store them in an unfinished area or an area that doesn't have steady climate control. So yeah, if it is a finished area, and again, you're not an area that's prone to flooding, like if you live in my old home, the place I used to live, Norfolk, Virginia, no, don't put your photographs in the basement in Norfolk. But if you're, you know, in an area that is not prone to flooding and your basement's finished, it is okay. I don't recommend storing them in the attic. However, even if you have like a finished attic space on the top floor of your house, just because that is more prone to high extremes of temperature and humidity, it's just more difficult to preserve the conditions, to keep stable conditions. So I have just two more quick slides here, and we're just gonna get through them, and then I am happy to stick around for questions, but I know we've gone over time, so I don't want to keep people if they're not. Helpful websites. There are numerous websites here that are going to give you tons more information. Two that I highly recommend. Northeast Document Conservation Center is an excellent resource for all kinds of preservation information. They are great. Just check it out. The Image Permanence Institute I mentioned is another place that is really helpful if you are looking to figure out what is going on with your photographs and how they have been damaged or how they might be damaged. Just to wrap up, ideas to take home: do no harm, keep it cool, dry, and dark. Consider the intrinsic versus informational value to decide whether it is worth the effort to preserve or conserve something. You don't have to save everything. You can reformat things. It is okay. Acid-free sleeves, folders, and boxes, if you find them, make sure they pass the PAT test. It's usually somewhere on the packaging. Or sometimes in the catalogs or on the website, there'll be like a specifications tab for archival materials that you can click. I will send you a list of archival providers so you can find these materials. Please properly and clearly label your materials. We have here the Brownie, who tells us that we should conceal our frowns with the greatest care, but let our smiles be free as air. So hopefully that cheers you up a bit. In closing, and before we get, while you type your many questions, I hope, I do want to do one quick switch and just give you a tale that hopefully won't scare you off. I do feel often when I do this presentation, and especially more so with photographs than with paper-based archival material like letters and diaries, that it can be a lot of, this is going to go bad, this is going to go bad, this is going to continue to age, Polaroids are doomed. And I feel like it's very negative, and I don't like that, because you can save these materials. Really, the conditions and the storage media that you put around them is all you need. And even then, they're plucky little items, so photographs can survive a lot of damage, and it's always amazing what can happen. So we recently got a new addition to the collection. It's Lizzie here. This is Lizzie Osborne. You can see, hopefully, Lizzie's really elaborate hat. Lizzie is a 10 type. Her name is written in pencil on the back.
We can see you, but not Lizzie.
You can't see Lizzie? Let's see. You can see Lizzie now, right?
No, we can only see you.
Ooh, okay, we'll switch it. We'll do it this way. That's disappointing.
I can see the scan pad in the back of you, but you're covering the...
No, I didn't switch
scan pad.
I'm a terrible person. Okay, there we go. Can you see Lizzie now?
Now we can see Lizzie.
Thank you for bearing with me. Okay, this is Lizzie Orison. She lived in Hamilton. The reason I'm showing you Lizzie is because someone came in and donated this 10 type to us recently because they found it in the roof of their home. So at some point after roughly 1880, Lizzie's 10 type was stuck in a roof. So there was, as I understand it, a 10 roof and then a new roof put on top of that. And Lizzie was somewhere in between. Now this is a 10 type. She is in excellent condition. So I've just told you how these are easily scratched. She's got a little bit of bending to her. You can see she's got a dent in the middle, but she is in really great shape. You can see this picture clear as day. The detail is still wonderful. So don't lose hope. Even if you just keep your photographs at home in an area that is cool, dry, and kind of dark, you're probably gonna keep them around. However, there are things we can do to help, and I'm happy to answer questions, but I hope you'll take a little bit of hope away with Lizzie's adventures. I don't think we'll ever know how she ended up in the roof. It's definitely her house that she lived at, that she was found in, so there's probably a good story there. But thank you for joining me today and bearing with me. This is just such a big topic. I always go over, but I am happy to answer questions, and hopefully Nora is also happy to continue relaying them. Sorry, Nora.
Could you talk about the PAT test, the photographic activity test, a little bit more?
Sure. So one problem with archival materials is that in general, there is no standard agency, and there's no agency that sets standards. So anybody can call anything archival. What the PAT test is an attempt to solve that problem specifically for photographs and other material that you don't want to have interact with chemical reactions. So what that is the standard setting agency, ANSI. I'm not going to waste time trying to remember what that acronym stands for. They test the materials, not for long-term stability, but just that the plastic itself is not active, like it's a stable plastic that is no longer having chemical reactions in it. So what tends to happen with plastics is over time, the chemicals that make up the plastic, which often are like petroleum-based products and other exciting things, become less stable, and so they become fugitive. So like with the covers in your magnetic albums or the top layer of your Scotch tape, that plastic, you'll notice it becomes yellow and brittle over time, and that's because chemicals are actually leaching out of it into the surrounding area. Once that sort of petroleum-based chemical has come out, the plastic starts to crack and become extremely brittle, and then eventually it'll just fall off, usually. But in that process, whatever is leached out of it goes into whatever it is touching. So the idea with the ANSI, the PAT standard, is that those plastics have been tested that they will not do that in theory over time. Now, they do stress test them with high temperature and humidity and things like that, but there's no way to really know long term. There are ways to test the plastics that you get. You can definitely, if you open up a new package of photo sleeves and they just smell like plastic, they're probably not the best quality plastic. Mylar does not smell plasticky at all. It has no smell to it. Similarly, there were tests I was taught in conservation classes where you can burn the plastic, tiny slips of it, and if it burns with like a bright green flame and like immediately goes up, it's probably not a great plastic. So I don't recommend setting fire to archival plastics in your home, but you can if you really want to try it. But generally, the PAT test, they have just tested it for stability. So it'll be on the packaging somewhere. It's just a little PAT, capital PAT. There's not a symbol or anything.
Well, it looks like that's all the questions for today. So thank you so much, Laura. Thank you everyone for joining us. And we will get the recording of this presentation and the slides out. It does take a little bit for the recording to process, but we will get this out to you. And thank you so much for joining us. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.